Okay, so here we are again, the Unschool Squad, here to answer some of the questions that we didn't get to in our last presentation for Joy Spring. I'm Deanna Kluth. I guess we'll just go around and begin the questions. And just as a precursor, I'd also like to say that Lisa spent a lot of time answering these questions, and so after we make a brief introduction, I'd like to invite Lisa to begin take us by the lead down that road, and we'll just also have a lot to share and let the conversation flow and answer any questions as they come, rather than wait until the end if anyone has questions who joins us. All right, so thank you for being willing to share publicly and take our group live, and for everyone who's going to be watching and listening to the recording, thanks for participating in this partnership with our children.
All right, our first unanswered question from our last meeting was, if your child wants a career that ultimately requires college and/or graduate degrees, how do you reconcile the unschooling path with a more conventional one? And, can an unschooled child make their way to that path if needed? And the answer to that is absolutely yes, they can. 100%. Many unschooled children have. And I guess the thing to really understand is that an unschooled child is incredibly comfortable and confident in doing the things that they want to do. They know they have the support of their parents. They know how to find resources. And whatever they need to get into college, they will do, whether that's learning algebra or calculus or sign language or really anything at all. And if you think about it, it's just kind of how adults learn. Like when we learn something, it's usually either because we're interested in it or we need to know it in the moment. It's useful to us at that time, and then we figure it out. An unschooled kid does the exact same thing. Yeah, I guess anyone else can join in.
Just a logistical question. I have someone that just messaged me that they're having trouble with the link. Is it still working?
Yes, it is. You want to just send them?
Should I just share it again? Okay. Sorry to interrupt the process.
That's all right. We want to make sure people are able to get here. I wanted to say that there's a history of unschoolers who get themselves into college and continue or start businesses, and skip the college, but both happen. And yes, it's interesting also to look at here's someone coming in, admitting. To look at even the context of the question of, can unschooled children make their way back into a traditional path if needed? I would say that this way is, even more traditional, going back further than the more recent, institutionalized education, industrial education.
Speaker.
Hi, Kate, welcome. I hear you and I don't see you. If you want to stay off camera. We were just beginning to answer questions from the last discussion that we didn't get to. If your child wants a career that ultimately requires college or graduate degrees, how do you reconcile their unschooling path with the more conventional one? And can unschooled children make their way back into a traditional path if needed? So we're just going to move through some of these questions. We actually put it in the chat. And you're welcome to ask questions either via the chat or unmute yourself and interrupt us. We won't wait until the end. We'll just make this more of a conversation. So welcome. Thanks for being here. Maria, did you want to add?
I do. Good morning, everybody. Good morning, Kate. And those of you who are going to watch later, thank you so much for joining us. I do want to say that none of us have children who are at that level, right? Where we're needing to worry about the transition to college. I do have a 15-year-old, and we are in conversations about it. But I think part of the unschooling path is to have the opportunity to explore who you are as a human being and how and what you value about yourself as you're growing into your adulthood, as you're growing just in general, not even with adulthood being the end all wonderful place to get to. It's just really being present in your process of becoming, right? That's how I really understand unschooling to be as I'm observing children go through it. And that being said, I feel that, and I've learned and understood that through that process, you uncover an immense possibility and an immense resource of how to direct your life. And what I mean by that is that you are able, from that place of deep knowing and deep trust in your abilities, to design your path forward. You become very, very clear about your passion. You become very, very clear about how to learn. You feel trusting in that ability of how you learn. And so by the time you get to that age where you want to transition into something like college, you are prime. You're actually prime and prepared and ready to engage with whatever that path is going to bring forth. Whatever those doors that open are going to bring forth and expose you to. And it's less of a weight and pressure of having to perform at a certain capability to be able to engage in the path of college, which I feel like it's a lot of what has happened to us when we have been schooled, is that you get to sophomore year, junior year of high school, and all of a sudden you're just feeling this intense pressure to have to perform at a certain way. But I think that for an unschooling child, if you unschool to high school, for example, you are prepared all along with this deep trust in yourself. And I think that's why I really want to address this idea of trust with this particular question, because this question has what we've come to know in our deschooling process has fear attached to it, right? It's this fear that my child is not prepared. And I think we have to kind of uncover the layers of what do we mean by prepared? And going back to my first point, for an unschooling child, being prepared is being clear about that deep knowing and having that relationship of trust with the self, about being able to walk into spaces, walk with spaces, information, be in communities, and engage with life from an empowered place of knowing yourself and of trusting yourself. And then if you're in an environment as an unschooler where the people around you have nurtured you with that trust, there's this added strengthening that happens to your personhood to be able to then go and transition to anything. It could be college, it could be a job. Maybe you decide, you know what, I've developed, let's say, my graphic design ability so well by the time I'm 13, 14, 16, that I think I'm just gonna get some tutors, take some certification courses, mix it up, and then move forward with a career in that particular arena. So I think that the magic of the unschooling path is that you don't narrow your possibilities, right? And in the trust that you build as you grow in this path, you actually widen the possibilities that you have access to. So that's my 2 cents on that.
I'd like to connect to what Maria just said. I want to add another component that I think is important here. That with all this process of trust and many opportunities that open up to people when they are in a place of trust, that I truly connected to with what Maria just said, is that the universe is there to help us. And in this process of doing things authentically, things are also very easy. Things happen on their own. So it's a whole process that if, for example, a child wants to head on to a career that requires college, things will develop on their own. Somehow it will just happen. And what I mean by that is when you are in the process of unschooling, one day your child is reading and you've done nothing to contribute to that except for being a house with books and reading and writing yourself, and all of a sudden you have a child who's reading beautifully right next to you, and you're like, when did that happen? I spoke to a friend of mine last week exactly on this topic, and she said, my parents, she's an only child, and she says, my parents did everything possible to prepare me to the best college education. And that started when I was very young. So from a very early age, everything that she did, her parents directed into this, future that they wanted for her of college. So there was a lot of effort involved, right? They had to make the right decisions. She had to be a good girl and a good student and do what's expected of her. She had to spend her time running from school to her extracurriculum activities and then back home to do her homework, and all that to get to this point that directs her to this desired or desirable college degree. That's a lot of work, and that's not an easy way to go through. When you unschool, your life is filled with decisions that you and your child make, and there's such an easy flow of life. You just wake up in the morning and you do whatever you like, and you wake up at the time that you want to wake up, and you go to bed whenever you want to go to bed, and you eat if you want to eat, and you don't eat if you don't want to eat. And life is just such a joyful, easy flow, and schooling or learning stuff about life is just something that is, part of the daily life, I guess. Not to say that life is only easy, but I'm trying to say that there is so much ease when people live their lives the way they choose to, and there is so much joy involved. And then, if that's the direction and that's where the desire is, college will just show up and the opportunities will open up. And if that's really a goal, our children are very determined. When they want to do something, they'll get there and they'll do it. And no matter how much effort is required, I would like to give an example, and then I'll be done with my 2 cents. So my daughter is very interested in learning Spanish, and she does take Spanish lessons on a weekly basis for the last couple of years. But she has such, big drive, such passion to learn this language and master it, that she decided that she wanted me to do, the app Duolingo for her. So I got the app for her, and she is sitting hours and hours every day on the application. And they have everything there. All you have to do is either type the words or talk to the iPhone or whatever she's using, whatever device she's using. But that's not enough for her. So she has a whole notebook where she sits and writes every sentence in Duolingo. And that's hard work. I look at her from the side and I'm like, oh my gosh, like it is not required at all. She'll get there anyway. But this is what she wants to do. So she's sitting and reading and writing, and she has these, pages over pages over pages of Spanish learning because that's the way she wants to do it. I'm not concerned that when the day arrives and if she wants to go to college, she'll do everything necessary to do that because she has it in her. It's self-directed. And when things are self-directed, we have all the time and all the energy to pursue them. And that's it. Thanks.
And Michal, tell everybody how old your daughter is, please.
Oh, she's 9 years old.
So it's not something that, we need to train kids to be or do.
And that I'm doing the Duolingo with her. Of course, I don't do the notebook part. I'm like, I don't have time for all this hustle. But I do sit with her and I'm like, what an opportunity in my life. I'm from a Spanish-speaking family and I never studied Spanish in my life. And I'm like, what an opportunity. My daughter is studying Spanish now and I can just tag along with her. And when she studies, I sit with my Duolingo as well. And I learn some Spanish and all of a sudden I'm like, oh, actually, I know this sentence. My father always said, it's such a celebration of doing stuff together and joining her on her journey and, being part of her interest in life.
Thank you, Michal. I'm going to say something that might be a digression, but it surely will come up in the journey and partnering with children and in just being in life. Obstacles happen, hopefully fewer, but sometimes unavoidable trauma happens. And for many people, those obstacles and traumas are on a daily basis. But it's true. I say this in response to the idea and the concept and the experience that Michal brings up of stepping into flow and joy. And that is absolutely true when you're aligned with, and this may get a little spiritual, with the divine, or centering with the flow of what is right for you and your own path. And this comes back to the kids directing themselves, right? It just becomes very clear what is the right next step, and there's a domino effect and doors open. So even in the face of like great obstacles and trauma, like the insurmountable kind of obstacles, for example, that Harriet Tubman went through, the path, a clear path opened for, movement and flow towards liberation. And ultimately, this unschooling path is a process of maintaining that liberation that we are born into, if we weren't born through a wounded womb. But we're all doing the deschooling and decolonizing and repairing and trying as much as possible to clear that way for these children who are so much more connected to that intrinsic self-determined, guided knowing than we are. We're learning with them, and my children are teaching me and reminding me how to do that. And yeah, we can look to other people and other older, unschooled, forever unschooled young adults, children who are now young adults who have gone through the process and found their way into their desired livelihood with or without any formal education, maybe apprenticeships or classes they've chosen to take. I mean, so that the data is also out there I know that there have been studies done, reported through the Sudbury schools and Peter Gray, and maybe we can gather some of those resources as well. Did anybody have anything else to say about that question? Should we move on to the next one? Go ahead, Lisa.
I can add to the question. The next question kind of blends into this one. And it is, does it happen more readily as maturity and interest increases? And I think what they're talking to when they say it is, they're saying, you know, does kind of a conventional academic learning or something that looks like it would segue into a college career, does that happen more readily as the children grow and age? And I guess I just wanted to say first, you know, back to this idea of trust, that if you think about it, schooling, conventional schooling is really based on the premise of not trusting that children will learn. And so, as Maria said, these questions are a little bit, there's fear behind them. There's a fear that the kids won't be prepared, that they won't be able to learn. And there's just such a different, it's very different when you are being coerced to learn something that is not your interest, or in the moment you're not wanting to do, versus like a kid who is simply following an interest. They're not thinking about learning. They're not even concerned with, oh, am I going to learn how to read, or am I learning math? They're concerned about whatever the interest is. And, you know, I have a 7-year-old who's very, very interested in reptiles and has been for many years. And he immerses himself in reptiles. And a lot of the things that he knows, I feel, are things that he would learn in college. If he were in college studying reptiles, like, he's already tapping into that base of knowledge, that level. Not because he wants to learn like something, like, it's only because he loves snakes and he loves, yeah. So I think back to the question was, you know, does it happen more readily? Do kids do some serious learning more readily as they mature? And I guess the one thing I wanted to say is that as long as we are looking for learning to look school in a school way, like as long as we're trying to see it in the way school sells us learning, you're doing a disservice to yourself and to your child, because learning is in absolutely everything. It's everything, everything, everything. And natural learning, like a child who's never gone to school, very rarely will the way that they're learning look as it does in school. It's not like, I want to learn to read. It's they learn to read because of all the things they love to do. You know, and for my kids, they've learned to read basically through gaming, through playing video games, through wanting to chat with people in the game, through wanting to be able to read what other people are chatting in the game. That's been the main, for me, that was the big difference from when they started reading to before. But all along, everything they were doing was building up to literacy. Like, even, again, studying frogs and reptiles, like, oh, what's this frog's name, or what's this snake's name? And they've, again, like Michal said, never, ever, ever had a reading lesson. And then one day they're reading. And it's something that you really can't imagine unless you've witnessed it yourself, because the way that we all learned in conventional school was predicated on not trusting that a child can learn to read. And so that fear, that mistrust of children and their ability to learn, it permeates absolutely everything else. And so when you're focused on this idea of like, when my kid is grown, will they be able to go to college? You're missing all of the teeny little steps and all the little bits of information along the way that are really just showing you and showing your child how they are capable and they are learning. And I think when you focus on that, you know, the future, you're really missing out the opportunity for connecting with your child in the present moment. And those are the connections that, if you are paying attention to, you can't help but see how brilliant children are. Because, you know, like you said, Deanna, my kids, I learned so much more from them than I could ever try to teach them, no matter what curriculum or cute thing I could devise, just by being present and helping them as they ask to research or find the things that they're interested in, I'm constantly blown away by all that they've learned. And I have, no fear that if they wanted to go to college, they could absolutely go. And they feel the same way too. It's like, oh, I want to learn, even like you were saying, Michal, your daughter learning Spanish. It's like my daughter learned sign language, and I wasn't even aware. Like I knew she liked it, but then one day she came down and she said, oh, I've memorized the whole sign language alphabet. And then she's just been signing. And you would think that would be a hard thing to do, right? All these little, hand like signs you have to make and remembering them. And it seemed like she just was like, I want to do it. And she did it. And that's kind of how it is with unschooling, because they're confident in themselves and they believe in themselves because they've never been forced to learn something that they don't want to.
Right, or judged as incapable and labeled and then pegged as, deficient in any way. And they are interested, so that motivates them. And you remind me of an article I read recently in, I think it might have been Peter Gray. No, I don't know. I'll find it and I'll share it. But I think it was in Psychology Today about math. That they're realizing that they did a study that teaching kids math in like 6th grade, they learned more and caught up with all the years of teaching up until then, totally flying in the face of the idea that math can only be learned by incrementally building on top, and yeah, maybe that's still true, but it can happen in such a short amount of time when you're interested. And it reminds me of one of the things I read about the Sudbury student or learner who spent years, like in his tween and teen years, just being immersed in playing video games, and then decided he was interested in becoming a brain surgeon, and in a very short window, maybe a year or two, right in preparation for college, got all the credits he needed, got all the learning he needed in order to apply, and went on to study and do the however many years of college and graduate education that is required for becoming a brain surgeon. So the learning can happen very quickly when the floodgates open. So it does come back to that trust of trusting and surrendering to trusting that they are learning, that we can support them, right? If we get our fear out of the way, we can be present enough to trust that we can be able to respond to the needs to support learning in the way that then we can also trust our children to tell us how they need to learn.
I have a couple of things to share, and maybe we can move on to the next question, or if there's something else that you guys are picking up from what we're sharing. I did post it on our chat, 3 episodes by Pamela Regia, her podcast, Living Joyfully. Her podcast has been instrumental for me, and I think for all of us at various points of our journey. The 3 episodes that I listed there are specifically related to being an older unschooler or an adult unschooler, and things that or growing up as an unschooler and what happens after that. So yeah, those might be great points or just resources to have as you are more curious about this journey.
Thank you, Maria.
And I also posted the article that Diana was referring to. And I did want to share a couple of things that we've read in the past that have been incredibly supportive to us as we've come in this unschooling squad and being together and sharing together and growing together. But it's also a resource that I find myself needing to go back to often, because fear, we live in a culture of fear, right? It's we are easily suggestible, meaning that our brains are fragile in that sense, you know, so we will follow information, we will follow practices, and sometimes without questioning them, because our nature is to trust, I feel. And then we have fear is sort of, it's a tool that is used, I think, on all of us and on various societies to control. And so this beautiful book, Parenting for Social Change by Teresa Graham Brett, was a fantastic book for our unschooling squad to read. And I want to just take a passage from that relating to that very thing. Teresa says, I advocate for liberating ourselves from this paradigm of control and domination, because it fundamentally limits our potential as human beings. Our choices are narrowed when we are afraid and when we believe that people should behave only in certain prescribed ways. Our creativity is limited and our capacity for growth and learning is stunted. I think that that's a really powerful point, right? And she really looks at the macro and the micro, right? So how culturally we have a system that prescribes a paradigm of control and domination upon our bodies, upon our minds. And it limits our capacity to be creative. And I think that I really want to highlight that in relation to trusting that your child can make that transition. I mean, I have friends, we have friends locally, and particularly some friends of mine who have children who chose to go back to school at middle school level, at high school level, or have chosen to go to community college after being unschooled their whole lives, and made a beautiful transition. I mean, there's so many stories where these children end up in honors classes in high school, or just really finding their way, or supplemented, being in high school age unschooler, and supplementing some of their interests with classes at community colleges. So really, almost there's a dismantling of barriers to think that you have to be a certain age to then engage with certain information, which is a lot of what Michal and all of you have mentioned. You know, you can be in high school and begin to take some courses on the field that you're most interested in at whatever level those courses are, because you trust that you can meet that. And I think that that's the piece in terms of being connected to your creativity and the possibilities that arise from that. Yeah. I will plug in the book as well on the chat.
I put the link in already for the book.
Yeah, you two are quick. Thanks so much for resources, Maria and Lisa. I just want to say one last thing on this subject. One thing that really caught my attention in one of Peter Gray's lectures in the Unschooling conference that was in New Jersey a few years ago, he talked about the fact that in some colleges, they allow unschoolers to, I don't know, go through a process, like the registration process a little differently than regular schooled kids. And many times what they have to go through is an interview. And sometimes that's all they have to do because they don't have any records of any other education from life. So they have this, big panel of experts interviewing them. And what I liked about what he described there is how these kids coming from an unschooling background are so driven and so interested and passionate of what they want to study in college that when they get to this interview, they've already read all the books that all these professors have ever written. They're truly, honestly interested in what these people have to say, and the conversation becomes very vivid and very deep. And those professors are most usually extremely or deeply impressed by these kids, just sitting there having this fluent conversation with them. And when I heard this lecture of Peter Gray, it was, I can't remember how many years ago, but the kids were around the age of 4 or 5, maybe 6. And we went to forest school the week after, and I looked at the kids, and each kid had another adult in the group that kid felt very comfortable with. And I was looking at, my friend's daughter, who always came to me during forest school to tell me about, I don't know, whatever she's going through in her life and what excites her. And I thought, no wonder these kids sit with these professors and discuss interesting issues with them. They do that from young childhood. They just speak to adults, and they feel very free and very open to discuss stuff with other adults that are not their parents. So when they come to college to this interview, this, just a regular day in their lives. And it makes it easy, easy again.
Yeah, and they're surrounded with adults who aren't telling them to be quiet because their voice is not important either. And yeah, I've heard that too, that colleges are really actually very interested in homeschoolers and unschoolers attending because of their interest and passion and preparedness, readiness, ability, like just wanting to be there is very different from the experience that these professors have with kids coming out of schools, more traditional schools.
If I could also, I wanted to quickly add that what I'm learning through this journey is that so much of my work is undoing, right? And I think we spoke about it on the last Q&A, but we've talked about it a lot in our group, this deschooling process. And it's interesting because there's a deschooling and then the decolonizing process particularly, but there's this other piece of acculturation just in general that relates to fear, which I had alluded to in my previous point in sharing. And I have found that to be the most difficult thing to overcome because fear is paralyzing. And when you're in relationship with children, as an adult, and you have lived in a culture that is predicated in control, that is the pool of information that we have from which we learn to be parents of young children. And so we always will have, as our primary mode of how to be with children, this perspective of control as the way to get to X. So personally, because fear is so paralyzing for me, my MO when I'm scared is to switch into control. And I feel like understanding that mechanism and engaging in a practice of not only reversing that mechanism, but actually learning the mechanism of trust, which is equally a mechanism, is equally a practice. Just as we have learned to be scared and switch into control, so we can learn to feel fear and switch into trust in that moment. And I think that switch arrived for me a couple of years ago. I've been in this quote unquote experience of unschooling, but there really was this hidden fear and control that was part of my parenting in my relationship with my children. And so 2 years ago, when that began to feel in my body, in my relationship with my own children, that began to not feel right. it began to feel non-authentic, as Michal mentioned and brought that word to us, right? It was incongruent, what I thought I was doing and what the children were experiencing. And so that undoing and that coming to awareness of that mechanism of fear to control meant that I had to really spend a lot of time within myself. And that was the moment that I realized not only did I need to deschool, but I actually needed to unschool myself. And I needed to be here through my learning journey, through the unschooling perspective. Like I needed to live it to really be in partnership with my children, because so much of the work is the undoing. And I love, there's another book that I have, and I'll actually plug in the book and I'll plug in the page for this particular quote. But just one of the lines is, I don't need to know how. I trust that a way will be revealed. And for me, that sentence really captures the mechanism of trust, which is to really acknowledge that this obsession that we have, particularly in this culture, to know, we have to know everything. We don't do without knowing, right? It's not our natural birthright. We are not born knowing everything. And even then, we are so capable and able to grow and develop. So yeah, I just wanted to bring that also, plug in that idea that addressing that question is really addressing, I would say to the parent, well, what is it that you might want to really become aware about the mechanism of fear and control that is behind that question right now? And how can your journey into supporting your child in that transition could be aided by you doing this work internally?
Thank you, Maria. I love how you're really holding that container of trust and bringing in all these quotes. You remind me of one of my favorite references from the poet Maria Rainer Rilke about living the questions. You know, so many times I am in a place of not knowing and just have to live the questions for a day or days or months. And the information that comes out of that through trusting that the answers and the knowing will come eventually. And I think we all have talked about and can relate to that experience of the mechanism from fear to control. I mean, I would think that all punishment and kids, you know, parents smacking kids on the hands or yelling at them, you know, for running into the street, it's all based out of fear and tremendous love, but we've been, you know, indoctrinated in a way that really is the opposite of love. It has the effect of yeah, I think Lisa, you were talking about and reading just disrupting that learning process and that confidence. So thank you for bringing that. That is so much of the conversations we have, and that is why we started this group and why we brought this group out publicly, was to share with folks the resource and benefit of having a support group, creating a support group like this one, and also, you know, knowing when you need to get additional tools and resources from either books or, you know, meditation, counseling, therapy. There's so many tools, and, you know, I've studied a lot of them, and when I get into that fear to control reflex in the past, you know, it's the practice that brings me back to that presence and awareness, because even with the practice, those tools go flying out the window. So yeah, kindness, forgiveness, self-forgiveness, gentleness, just healing all of those judgments and wounds. This is hand in hand work with the decolonizing, unschooling, deschooling part of unschooling. Yeah, and getting to that trust is such a key, I won't even call it a goal. It is a living practice. It's like breathing, you know, inhale and exhale, and just keep coming back to that center. The next question also relates, how free are you with kids' access to media? Relates to that fear and trust and control. We can almost answer the question with all the same answers.
I have, I was gonna say, I have a good, like, I had something sort of that I wanted to say to this, right? This question, just like the ones before it, come down to trust, like trusting children with media, and also like wanting to know like what's okay or like what's appropriate, like as if there's one sort of standard for everyone. But I think basically, like as an unschooler, to me, it's like, for me, it's really important that we recognize that children are fully human, right? Their desires and their interests and their wants and their values are just as important and valid as those of adults. You know, kids have like the same desire for connection and self-determination as any other human. And, you know, they should be allowed to live in the time and place in which they were born, and they should be allowed to have access to the tools of the culture in which they were born. And in our culture, that includes, you know, tablets, smartphones, computers, the internet, you know, video games, computer games, as well as books and puzzles and access to the outdoors. All of those things are part of living here. And it's, for me, it's like, if you wouldn't tell your partner or your spouse how much time they're allowed to use their phone or their computer or their iPad, I wouldn't do that to my child, because again, in unschooling, it's about building a partnership with your children and about making a connection with your child rather than controlling them. And as soon as you put a limit on screen time, you're controlling your child. This also comes back to the idea of trust. Like, because we trust our children and because we enable them to follow their own interests, and we're not judging them, as you had said, Deanna, we're not like looking at what they're doing and giving them a grade for it or an assessment. They also trust us with what they are doing on the internet. Like, they're not feeling the need to hide or sneak. And if something feels uncomfortable to them, they will talk to us about it. And because they've never been coerced, they've never been told you need to stay in this classroom or in this class, even though you don't want to, they are very comfortable and confident with removing themselves from any situation that has the faintest like whiff of control or discomfort from somebody else. So basically, in a way, it's like they're almost peer pressure proof, right? They've never been pressured by us, by teachers, to be a certain way or do certain things. So they will not stand for that. You know, a lot of people are worried about like online predators, you know, this, again, this fear of like some bad person lurking. And I'm not saying that they don't exist, but I'm saying that because our kids we haven't normalized this idea of being obedient or staying in a situation that makes them uncomfortable, or, you know, suppressing their own needs and wants and desires because they're supposed to, because an adult has told them so. They won't stay in those situations online or in person. They will remove themselves. They will also say, you know what, this isn't right. This isn't how people deserve to be treated. And they will report people or they will seek out help. So So back to how free am I with my kids and their access to media? Totally free. They each have their own iPads. Two of my kids have their own computers. My third child hasn't decided what kind of computer she wants. So we have a gaming PC, we have a Mac, we have Nintendo Switch, we have Wii. To me, these are all learning devices. And all of their things are outfitted with Netflix, YouTube, Hulu, a ton of different apps, basically anything they want. And if they want something new, they're just like, hey, I'm interested in this. And then I'm like, sure, let's get it. You know, not that I'm allowing it. It's just more like they're sharing what their interest is and I'm facilitating it for them because it's all learning. And as I mentioned earlier, my kids learned to read by using the internet and by playing video games. And even math, as you were talking about, Deanna, just recently my middle child was kind of like, oh, I'm curious about math, like what my math level would be in school. And she got on Khan Academy and logged into her grade level, and it was like, no big deal. It was like, oh, I can do all of this. And even me, I was watching a little bit like with trepidation, like, oh no, like, is this going to be one of those situations where, you know, something happens and it like hurts her confidence? But instead it was like, oh yeah, I know how to do this and I know how to do this. And even calculating in her head things that I was certain I would need to write down on a piece of paper. And it was just, you know, all of her experience of living in the world and using math naturally to bake, to level up in a video game, to strategize in a video game. It is tantamount to doing schoolwork at a level, and not that I even care or that she cares. It just was something that came up as her interest. And again, it's just like, because she's allowed to play video games, because she has an iPad and can use it however she wants, she's learning to trust herself, to follow her own interests, but she's also learning the more conventional subjects of reading and writing and math and history and science. Anyway, okay, I'll let someone else go.
I think you about covered it. I'll just share that I also have, at the moment, unlimited, give them, or I don't even say, even the language of like, give them, let them. It's like I have to reframe and reprogram so much of this conditioning. Yeah, we just have unlimited use of media, and we have read about both sides of the coin, you know, and the arguments of addiction and blue screen and all the benefits, and you know, where there's concern, you know, if there's things that come up, that have come up for us are around like being more grumpy after and unable to respond to the present, being present after extended periods, or skipping, you know, meals, or, you know, a concern about they're not drinking enough. Well, even in general, one of my kids doesn't drink as much as the other, or I perceive that, you know, but she does it differently. And, you know, I'm realizing now after all this concern that she's actually is tending to her body, but it was also my perception that wasn't accurate. But the point is, we have conversations when things come up, and ultimately they make their own decisions. Or, you know, I'll even express my fear. You know, sometimes I'll hold back so that I don't influence them. But so it's this dance of awareness and discernment of you know, age appropriate conversations and you know, what's gonna undermine their learning, and you know, mistakes of just blurting out my fear and that control switch that happens and has happened and probably will continue to happen as I continue to unlearn. But it's a process. But ultimately, like Maria said, you know, it doesn't feel good when I try to control or when I exert control out of fear. So just trusting, you know, that as a cue also for what feels good in my body, and noticing what feels good in them. And are they happy? Are they learning? You know, just like stepping back, you know, doing my own work and assessing what's going on in here, but really stepping back and trying to remove that filter to really see clearly. And yeah, it's so much fun and learning and connection. It's a way that, especially in this quarantine, they're connecting with their community, and it's healthy. So yeah, I think Lisa covered a lot of it. I just wanted to share where we're at with that. So I'll pass the baton.
Can I wanted to connect to two things that Lisa brought up, and you were talking about it too, Diana. So I'll start with the first one. That's about opportunities and what our world is like today. Wanted to give an example from our life that I think really helped me decide that I'm never going to limit screen time with my daughter. And also I will not limit her access to any kind of electronic device that she's interested in. So both my husband and I studied many things until we ended up with a profession that has nothing to do with what we studied in college. So my husband studied architecture, and he also had his own wood shop. He's a carpenter. Nowadays, his work, and that's what also brought us to the United States, he works with digital screens. So he's surrounded by screens, and that's his work for many, many years now, almost the last 20 years. And I studied art and fashion designing, and later on education, but never mind. The point is this. If our daughter loves art and she does art all day and all night, we're satisfied with it, right? We're happy. I provide her with the best equipment I can buy with our money, right? She has the best whatever, paint and brushes and scissors and anything, pencils. She's got the best of the best because I really appreciate art and I want her to be able to create with the best tools possible, right? If she's interested in working with wood, with my husband, she wants to know more about all the tools that he's using and see what he's building, and then she wants to use all the little pieces of wood and build her own creations. We're happy about it. Then why should we treat differently her interest in screens? This is also one of her parents' profession. She grows up in a house with so many screens. We don't have a TV, but we have, you know, rooms filled with screens because this is what my husband does. And she's exposed to it. And so I don't see any reason to decide that one profession is acceptable and we're going to promote it and help with it when she's interested and something else is not. So for me, it was very clear from a very young age that this is what her father does. So of course she'll do it too. And she is extremely interested in screens. I can't take that from her. The other thing that I wanted to talk about that Lisa mentioned, and Diana, you expanded it even more, is trusting them, being online and connecting with other people. I actually had my breaking point or my low point regarding this issue in the last few days. I don't know what brought me to the FBI website and reading about their recommendations for safe online searching for kids. I read about online predators. It was terrible. It brought me into so much fear, and all of a sudden, all my trust was out the window, and I was like, oh my God, what am I doing to my daughter? I was very concerned. I made her sit down on the couch with me. I read the whole page to her. I never do such stuff, but I was so concerned all of a sudden. I'm sharing this here because we also have these moments, right? I was all of a sudden so afraid to her. And yesterday she had another episode online, playing, I think, Roblox or something like that. And there were two adults there being very aggressive to each other. And she chose to join into this argument and, you know, vocalize herself there. And she was trying to help the, you know, the weaker part of the argument there. Somebody was bullying someone else, and she came, and the bullying side wanted to get the telephone number, address, and everything of the other person. And the other person was quite aggressive too, but not as aggressive. She was weaker. And she keeps coming to the kitchen telling me, oh, he said that, she said that. Oh, I'm afraid she'll give him her telephone number. He must be, you know, someone dangerous. She should be aware. I should private chat with her and tell her that. And at some point I said, enough with all of this. You don't know who they are. Maybe both of them are adult men or male trying to get you into this. I don't know. I was so afraid all of a sudden. I told her, please just leave this room, you know, leave the play, whatever space that she was at, and join a different game. I don't think it's the right way to deal with it, but I was in such moment when it happened. And all of a sudden I doubted her ability to, you know, to go through safely through this situation. I was so concerned. And talking to you now, or hearing you talking now, I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? Because I broke her trust in herself and her confidence by saying that. I was basically suggesting that she doesn't know how to deal with it and that she's too little to deal with such things. The way she was looking at it was, I know things that that little girl doesn't know. I'm going to help her. I'm going to be on her side, helping her fighting the big bad guy. And I didn't let her play. It's also play. She is learning how to navigate herself in life. And I interrupted it and I didn't let her do it. So
Even
reflecting on my moment of weakness.
But even that interruption is an opportunity for learning how to navigate real life situations, right? If this was in an office and someone is having that argument, or you feel like you're going to step in and help one side out, and then someone else tells you, no, don't get involved. That's a real situation, and there's learning in that, and there'll be learning in conversations you have following up and sharing the place of fear you were coming from and hearing more about, you know, her experience. All of that is learning, and yeah, and that fear is real and visceral. That's a great example to bring into this of, yeah, that we come across these things and we're paralyzed, as Maria said, with all of this fear of what to do. We're indoctrinated in not getting involved, you know. I can't tell you how many times growing up in New York City and Manhattan, like, you know, the thing was you don't get involved. But we're learning now that no, we need to get involved, and work as communities to help each other, to be a village.
I have something. May I? Are you ready, Diana? Thank you. That was really powerful, Michal. Thank you so much for sharing that. Yeah, that was really, really powerful, very useful as we think about what the process looks like. And if I may, I just want to kind of really point out what Michal just said. I hope I don't sound repetitive, but I just felt like it was so, so powerful. And one of the pieces was what we value. And I know Lisa has really brought that to us a lot in our group. This is something, Lisa, that you have really spearheaded in terms of this idea of, one, we are conditioned to put value on certain things more than others. And two, those that sense of value on certain things are equated to success. And so thinking outside of that it's scary, number one, and sometimes it feels virtually impossible. And speaking as someone who is an immigrant, has had an immigrant experience in this country, is a person of color via my father, is married to a Black man and is raising children of color. This specifically, what we value is so much part of our experience as it relates to success. And that has been very difficult to address within myself, because the fear that my Black mixed children won't be able to succeed if they don't have the right tools, if they're not valuing what we've been taught to value and going to that path, means that they'll be disadvantaged even more so, means that they won't have, etc. Right? So if we follow the arc of that fear, it's just like, okay, my children are doomed. Already in a society that dooms Black children. So I just want to really name that. When Michal brought this issue about like, why do I value her making art versus her daughter making art versus her daughter watching screens? Like, I think that's a really important piece. And I just wanted to outline that. Next, oh, by the way, that has been a huge arc for me to really undo that piece around screens from my own family. And I'll get to my process in a bit, but I also wanted to highlight, and Deanna, you also touched upon this a little bit as well, very poignantly, that when you unschool and you are in a relationship of trust where your praxis is to exist in a relationship of trust with your child and with yourself, of course, there is another path forward in terms of addressing things like screens or anything that comes up that's going to trigger a fear, which is that you can follow a path of presence versus a path of letting your child do X, Y, and Z. And I think that that's where you caught yourself there, Deanna, which was a really powerful moment. I love that because this is a praxis, right? Presence versus letting or being the authority in what happens. And then Michal, as she was talking about her example, you could see the way that as an unschooler, she was present, right? Through the process, Michal's daughter had this beautiful trust in the relationship with her mother that she would go back and forth in the kitchen. I really need to enunciate this because that's what a relationship of trust looks like, right? So for me, I did my little chart on my journal, and it looks like presence leads to communication. And it's like this constant flow of communication with your children that can go in all kinds of directions, but primarily that's like the source of the trust building in the relationship. And that leads to safety. But safety in that context is actually, what I wrote was self-regulated. And what Michal is sharing is that she got to the place where fear showed up there, right? So fear showed up as a block within that communication where it became so intense that she actually stalled the process of her daughter getting into the place of self-regulated safety that comes with trust. And what happened there, I feel, is this ingrained process that we all have of thinking that we have to control process based on what we value, which leads to more control, right? And in the example of Michal is that she had to pull her back She had to pull her daughter back. So that was the control mechanism, which creates this idea in terms of safety that protection is dependent on others. Our protection and our safety depends on others. And so these are it's sort of like what I was able to catch on Michal's example, which I think is super important for unschooling kids. And it's something that I struggle. Just because I caught it right now, it doesn't mean that it's something that I know and live, as Michal mentioned, but it's this idea that the goal is to be so present in a child's life where communication is overflowing. Communication is the source of safety. Communication is the source of safety, and which leads to self-regulated safety, which leads into the child, as Michal mentioned, trusting herself and her ability to observe what's happening and keep herself safe. I thought that was so powerful, Michal. Thank you so much for sharing that. And yes, of course, I guess I'm naming it as like two binaries and two processes, but they're all interwoven. Why? Because we've all been institutionalized in this way of thinking and in this way of valuing. So we, as unschoolers who are beginning to unschool our children, we're going to go through that back and forth. For our children, it's interesting, right? For our children, it's a very different process of, and I'll speak about my experience. I'll talk about my son because I've learned so much through having this relationship of presence with my son. Our children are also unregulated on the screen use, but it wasn't always that way. As I mentioned earlier, you know, that I had this more of a relationship of control before. And so since that has shifted in our family, our children use time. The main piece where we sort of address our children's needs and health is when we feel that something's coming up, or as Diana mentioned, that there's something that doesn't seem as balanced to my perspective. And so I bring it up in a conversation like, hey, this is how I'm feeling about what I'm noticing. And I use that language a lot. Like, this is what I'm feeling about what I'm observing in your experience. And tell me how that feels, how that sounds to you. Let's talk about it. So that's how I would address whatever's coming up as my fear in terms of their use. But my son is very interested in two particular games, which are Minecraft and Fortnite. And these two games have not only are they two of the biggest games out there, but they also have paths within them that users explore, various paths. And even though it's like you build with blocks or you fight with your swords on Minecraft, or in Fortnite, you shoot at each other and you try to be the last man standing, there's actually communities, socialization happening, there is strategy happening in both of these games. And the more I am present with my son through this learning that he's experiencing, the more I actually see the deep nuances and the deep learning that is taking place. And the relationships that rise up from being a gamer with other gamers, and his own self-regulated safety that he's coming to learn even more as he's developing these relationships with gamers that he doesn't know. No names get exchanged, you know, like we really talk about media literacy and online presence literacy in terms of how you engage with a stranger online. We've talked about that, but my son is on his Discord line with these gamers every day. And they really focus on conversations about the game. One time they all gathered, I can go into I've learned so much about Minecraft and guilds, but I don't want to bore you with that. It's just like such a fascinating thing. But he's playing with members of his guild. And I look over and I watch him and all these other members, and they're talking to each other as well on Discord. And I watch them, and they are all practicing together this one move of building bridges for this one server and game called Skywars. And they go, they build, and there's a certain way of building, and like the more speedy you are, the better you can be as a gamer. And then they practice and they go up and down and out, and somebody falls and they crack up and they start from the beginning. And they're doing this for half an hour. If we were to bring our idea of value that is ingrained by our society, it would be a moment where it's like, what are you doing wasting your time? Why are you not doing X, Y, and Z to prepare yourself for high school or whatnot? But what is really happening is that there's relationship being developed, there's strategy, there's a teachable moment that they're organizing collaboratively as gamers in that moment. There's helping each other become better gamers. There's just so much. I mean, it's going to be interesting if Kaba then decides to go into this kind of field later on, because when I need to at any point, and I meant to say this earlier when we were talking about college, if there's a point where I need to translate his unschooling process into a transcript for an application for college per se, if that was necessary, I mean, I really have a lot to look at when it comes to the screen use of my children. And that's just like a little picture into my son's experience. There really is so much I can say, but it really has been a journey to get to that trust of my child, and a deliberate, and this is what I would say, like, unschooling is not easy. The amount of presence that is required for this relationship is huge compared to other types of homeschooling or compared to schooling. There's a deep difference. And maybe we can talk about that too a little bit if everybody wants to. Like, there is a deep, deep difference with the level of presence required.
Thank you for naming that, Maria. You reminded me and really illustrated that my journey to unschooling began with the desire to maintain open lines of communication with my child and then children, and a bond of trust, and that being the foundation of being able to, well, back then it was like to protect them, to keep them from becoming lost, to have a open door for them to communicate with me about anything. And you know, now that view has skewed a little, really, like what I think, Lisa, you were sharing and illustrating about that self-protection. I mean, and we know psychology you know, illustrates also that victim of any kind of bullying or abuse or whatever, there's usually that vulnerability of not being able to be empowered by their own authority. And so that communication, it was such a beautiful like moment to see that reflected, and viscerally remember that is the root of this journey for me, that communication and trust. And I forgot what else I was going to say. I do want to point out it's 12:50, and just checking in about the time and what else we want to talk about. And I know, Lisa, you want to say something.
Well, I wanted to connect to all that Maria said. I mean, we've all been talking about this for a while, but I guess there's a couple things I wanted to say, right? There's this, even to say like, oh, you know, just trust your kids and it'll all be okay. it almost implies this like hands-offness, right? Like we just trust that they'll be fine, so we just let them do their thing. But it's not like that at all. Like Maria said, there's this presence, like so much energy and presence, so much more than controlling a kid, where you could just say, nope, this is my rule and you need to obey my rule. And there's a lot less effort in that than there is to sit with your kids as they explore something, particularly if it's something that makes you feel uncomfortable, something that stokes your fear. It takes a lot of energy, a lot of self-reflection, a lot of biting your tongue, and just a lot of, you know, basically holding yourself to know that, like, even though you're doing something that maybe you don't know anyone else who is doing it, you don't have a personal example of someone else who has given their child free access to all the tools of the culture, like just being able to remind yourself that, yeah, you know, we're trying something different and like we're gonna see what happens. And another thing it reminded me of is that I often think this, that unschooling is mindfulness in action, right? There's so many books about mindfulness. There's so many adults out there like who have mindfulness practices. They meditate every day. They're trying to stay present in the moment. And unschooling is that. It's mindfulness in action. Hold on, excuse me.
Totally agree. And right now Lisa's being present with her family and being mindful.
Yes, we're making my son, speaking of YouTube and just all the things you learn, he has been really interested. He's always really been interested in spice, in heat. About 2 years ago, he became very, very, very fascinated by hot peppers. And he was learning the Scoville heat units of all these different varieties of peppers. And we had lists posted all over the house, like of all the hottest peppers, where they're grown, what their individual Scoville heat unit was. And then that led to, you know, an interest in spicy ramen and watching YouTubers eat really spicy food and watching their reactions, which they think are hysterical. So we actually went, I went to the store, he asked me to get all these peppers, and I brought these peppers home, and he picked up a jalapeno, which isn't even the spiciest of peppers, but he picked up this jalapeno and just, like bit into it. And he, like, immediately started vomiting all over our kitchen, right? And it's like one of these things where, like, I'm trying not to laugh, but it's really funny, you know? And he's like, as he's vomiting, he's like, oh my, I had no idea that would give me such a reaction. You know, this very, like, scientific observation of this thing that he has just put himself through. But anyway, so this led him, we're watching this one YouTuber who makes a lot of Asian food. And so we watched this recipe for making bao and also dumplings. So yesterday I went to the Asian market and I got all the ingredients for making dumplings, and he just came in because he can't find the ginger, because he's in the kitchen prepping for when we're gonna go make dumplings together after this call. Anyway, so I got off track of what I was saying, but I guess back to this idea of like unlimited, you know, access to, I don't even like to call it
presence. You were talking about presence.
Unschooling is mindfulness and action was the quote I wrote.
Okay, right. So like in the moment, I could be tripping out on all this time spent watching YouTubers eat spicy food, and like, what is this about? What's it even for? And I even think about limits, like, okay, so if he had had a 30-minute limit a day, you can only watch YouTube for 30 minutes a day, would we ever have gotten to the place of cooking dumplings? You know, probably not. And I guess that also leads back to this idea of scarcity, right? Like when we control things for our children, particularly I think about, I hate saying screen time because I think it's just such a like small word for what having access to a computer and the internet really is, which is really learning anything and everything you could possibly want to learn. But when we limit our kids, when we place them in this, like, you only have this amount of time, well, that scarcity really affects what they get out of it and how they feel about themselves for even using it. Like, you know, they really enjoy exploring the world. And if we tell them that it's bad to spend a certain amount of time on the internet, well, that translates to I am bad. The things that I like are bad. Like, and then as they're using it, they're not just using it, they're using it with this layer of like, I could be using my time to be doing something better, or like I could be doing something more productive, or, you know, I'm being lazy, when in reality, it's not lazy at all. I mean, it's like tantamount to having like multiple sets of encyclopedias plus like access to travel all over the world. Do you know what I mean? And I think, again, back to what Maria was saying about community and socialization. Oh, here's my son again. Excuse me.
And she brings up something that also reminds me of the inability to focus, like in college, you know, and diving into, or as a scientist, or any job that requires immersion, right? Or even long-term, like 8-year studies. A lot of kids aren't gonna get there when the bell rings and interrupts, you know, your process, and you gotta go on to your next class. Whereas, you know, what you're talking about, Lisa, is that freedom to completely immerse and focus and follow this interest and this study, being able to do focused study like that, you know, it's a skill, it's a tool, it's a muscle that's being built to be able to do that.
Yeah, I also wanted to link back to what Maria was saying about, you know, her son making friends with these people in his games. And even back to this idea of college, and again, back to like YouTube in particular, I think about what a gift it is for anybody, but even like a 7-year-old, my son is 7, to be able to connect with experts in his own particular field of passion through YouTube. Like, again, back to snakes. It's like he watches herpetologists from all over the world, people who have so much knowledge. It's almost as if he is sitting in college lectures with college professors as a 7-year-old. And again, because this is his interest. And right, like you said, that depth, this depth of going deep down a rabbit hole. But again, like this fear of like, will they be ready for college? Where I feel in some ways like they're already behaving as college students. Or as we wish college students were behaving, because most college students are actually like getting drunk and like partying, right, and just trying to not fail out. You know, they're not actually in there like, this is the time where I have these amazing resources and let me get the most out of it. But
right, they're trying to figure out their own boundaries and who they are, whereas we're enabling that all along. I think everything you just talked about is a good place to close. We're at 1 o'clock, and we covered a lot, and of course there's always so much more to talk about. But yeah, I think you kind of brought it right back to the questions of you know, college preparedness, acceptance, and trust, and media, like all of that it comes right back to that, trusting our children and doing the work to be able to trust ourselves. So thank you. To be continued. I love you guys.
Thank you, everyone.
thank you. Bye.
All right, bye for now.
Bye.